The night before the world changed, the beaches of Normandy slept beneath a curtain of rain and wind. In the dark, German sentries huddled in damp bunkers, listening to the hiss of the sea against Rommel's steel defences. To them it was just another stormy night on the Atlantic Wall, one of 1,000. None could imagine that by morning the horizon would ignite with ships' fire and the death rattle of the Reich itself. Tonight we step inside the boots of the defenders. The men who watched the French sky turn black with paratroopers and the English Channel boil with ships. We know the story of D-Day from the beaches, from the soldiers who stormed them, from the films that made it legend. But few have ever heard it through German eyes. What was it like to stand inside a pillbox as the sea itself seemed to attack? To watch the enemy appear not from one direction, but from the sky, from the surf, from every shadow of the dawn. This is not a story of heroism or hatred. It's the story of disbelief, confusion, and the quiet terror of men who realized that history had come for them. The first week of June 1944, Normandy was grey, quiet, and tired. Along the bluffs, soldiers smoked in silence, staring out toward the Channel, that grey sheet of nothingness that separated them from the inevitable. For months, they had been told that the invasion was coming. They didn't know when or where, but they felt it in the air. The Atlantic Wall stretched like a scar from Spain to Norway, a vast monument to Hitler's paranoia and Rommel's engineering. To the men who guarded it, it was both fortress and prison. General Erwin Rommel had inspected these beaches many times, furious at their weakness. He called it a wall, but he knew it was hollow. There wasn't enough concrete, not enough steel, not enough men. French labourers and Italian prisoners had been forced to build the bunkers, some of them sabotaging the work, hiding air pockets in the cement. Rommel improvised where he could, captured tank turrets buried in the sand, fields of mines, wooden stakes tipped with explosives. And his strange invention, the Rommel's asparagus, long wooden poles strung with wire, meant to rip apart gliders before they touched down. Still, morale was brittle. The men of the 7th Army were an exhausted mix of veterans and convalescents, the ear and stomach battalions they were called, men too deaf, too wounded, or too weary for the Eastern Front. Among them were foreigners, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, forced into German uniforms, waiting for the first chance to desert. Even the officers were unsure. "We knew our tanks weren't good enough," said one commander. "We knew our men weren't strong enough. But orders were orders." And then came the weather. The wind roared across the Channel, beating against bunkers and bending barbed wire flat. German meteorologists swore that no fleet could cross in such storms. Rommel believed them. He left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that he'd have days to prepare before anything happened. He planned to meet Hitler and ask for more panzers, more steel, more time. On the night of June 5th, the Atlantic was restless but not alive. Patrol boats withdrew. Floodlights went dim. Inside the command posts, officers poured drinks, relieved that the invasion had once again failed to appear. Cigarette smoke filled the rooms. Maps lay forgotten. Somewhere a gramophone played a scratchy waltz. Then, just after midnight, the sky began to hum. First came the low drone, distant, constant, like a swarm of bees behind the clouds. Then the bombs fell. The earth trembled. Men staggered into trenches, pulling on helmets, shouting orders that vanished in the thunder. Above them, shadows moved between the stars. Hundreds, then thousands. Gliders sliced through the clouds, silent as ghosts. In the chaos, one officer, General Joseph Reichert of the 711th Infantry Division, stumbled out of the mess hall, pistol in hand, half-drunk, eyes wide with disbelief. The sky was raining men. British paratroopers were descending directly on his command post. He fired blindly into the night, shouting at his men to hold their ground, unaware that the war had already landed around him. Elsewhere, another officer, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Fawley, never made it back to his headquarters. He was ambushed and killed by American paratroopers just behind the lines. Across Normandy, communication lines were cut. Radios went dead. Orders vanished into static. Soldiers woke up to the sound of their own anti-aircraft guns firing blindly into the fog. By dawn, the wind had shifted. The rain had stopped, and far out on the grey horizon, something massive began to move. Through their binoculars, German spotters could see it first, a dark line stretching across the sea, growing wider, closer, until it became clear what it was. Ships, hundreds of them, thousands, the greatest armada the world had ever seen. And as the waves broke against the shore, a voice shouted down from a watchtower, "Feindliche Flotte gesichtet," enemy fleet sighted. The invasion of Normandy had begun. At first, the men thought it was just another morning bombardment. The Allies had been pounding the coast for months, sending their bombers like clockwork. But this was different. The noise came not from above, but from the sea itself, a deep, rolling thunder that shook the bunkers as though the earth were breathing. Inside the command posts of the 716th Infantry Division, coffee cups trembled, pencils rolled across the map tables, and then the lights went out. The first shells from Allied battleships slammed into the cliffs, exploding with such violence that sand turned to glass. Machine gunner Heinrich Savilo, of the 352nd Division later, said it felt like standing inside a bell that someone was striking with a hammer. Dust filled the air. Bunkers disappeared in clouds of smoke and pulverized concrete. Men clawed for their rifles, coughing, shouting, half-blind, their ears ringing like church bells in hell. Out on the beaches of Omaha, the 352nd was Germany's strongest hand, a division with real soldiers, real training, and the grim determination of those who had fought too long to still believe in miracles. When Zavilo peered through his slit window, the sea had changed color. It was no longer grey, but brown with churned-up sand and red with something else. He opened fire. The water spouted like fountains where his bullets hit. When the little fountains got close to the Americans, he said, they threw themselves down. All across the shoreline, the dark shapes of men were crawling, slipping, trying to reach cover behind the wooden obstacles Rommel had ordered driven into the sand. Each obstacle was tipped with mines. Each one was a trap. Nearby, Lieutenant Freya Koenig, manning an artillery post above the beach, could barely watch. They were poor swine, he whispered, even as he called for another barrage. So many of them so young. The defenders at Sword Beach, on the other hand, were not so hardened. Their fortifications were incomplete. Sandbags instead of bunkers, rusted guns mounted on concrete that hadn't yet dried. Lieutenant Karl Haider of the 716th remembered how his men were exhausted, half-trained, and forever waiting for replacements who never came. Many of them were Ustrepen, Soviet prisoners forced to fight in German uniforms, terrified and unmotivated. Some were old enough to remember the trenches of 1918, others were boys who had never fired a rifle. When the British landing craft opened their ramps, Haider's men fired once, twice, then the beach disappeared in smoke and flame, tanks with strange attachments, rotating flails, bridges, rockets, rolled through the surf like creatures from another world. We thought the devil himself was coming, one soldier said later. By 7:30 a.m., the radios were chaos. The word Überfall, invasion, echoed through every channel, followed by bursts of static and panicked shouting. In the command bunker near Cannon, General Friedrich Dollmann of the 7th Army slammed his fist on the table. His officers were demanding reinforcements, but the panzers couldn't move. Only Hitler could authorize their deployment, and Hitler was asleep. They called again. Nothing. One aide suggested waking him. No, Dollmann said bitterly. Let him sleep. Perhaps he dreams of victory. Meanwhile, the beaches burned. At Utah Beach, the 709th Division, older men, mostly, many with hearing aids and medals from the last war, stared at the sea in disbelief. Some thought it was a diversion. Others prayed it was. Yet even as they watched, paratroopers appeared behind them, cutting their communication lines, seizing bridges, dropping from the clouds like an army of ghosts. One sergeant recalled standing on a dune and seeing the horizon vanish under the silhouettes of ships. I thought the end of the world had come, he said. By mid-morning, the smell of cordite and blood hung over Normandy. The sea was filled with burning craft, drifting bodies, and shattered equipment. American bombers still circled overhead, their silhouettes briefly illuminated by flashes of naval gunfire. In one bunker, a young radio operator named Hans Keller tried to tune his set to Berlin. The line was dead. He looked at his sergeant, pale and shaking. They sipped her everywhere, Keller whispered. Everywhere at once. The sergeant stared at the map, red pins for enemy sightings spreading like an infection across the coastline. Then we hold, he said quietly. We hold until someone remembers we exist. But no one would. As the morning wore on, Allied forces began to break through the wire and mines. At Omaha, the tide turned, literally. The rising water swallowed the obstacles, washing the wounded away. The Germans fired until their barrels melted, until their belts were empty, until the sound of their own guns drowned out their heartbeat. And still the sea kept coming. By the time Rommel's car sped back toward the front that evening, the beaches were no longer German. They belonged to history. At Army headquarters outside Paris, the teletypes rattled like teeth in a fever dream, each strip of paper bringing worse news than the last. Bridges gone. Phone lines cut. British at sword. Americans ashore at Omaha, yet inside the Reich Chancellery the curtains were still drawn. The Führer had not been awakened. For nearly 10 hours, the panzers of the reserve, Germany's only real answer to an invasion, sat motionless in their forest bivouacs. Drivers slept on engine decks, crews played cards in the turrets, waiting for the order that never came. When it finally arrived, the roads were already clogged with refugees, burning trucks and strafing fighters. The chance to throw the Allies back into the sea was gone before the tanks had even shifted into first gear. Along the coast, the survivors of the morning bombardment fought like cornered animals. At Gold Beach, gunner Friedrich Wörster's battery of captured Czech guns still fired sporadically, though half his men were dead and the air stank of cordite and seaweed. Every time I looked up, he wrote later, the horizon was aflame. It seemed that the entire ocean had decided to kill us. When British Shermans finally reached the dunes, the Germans surrendered almost with relief. Further east, the 21st Panzer Division tried to form a counterattack under Major Hans von Luck. He remembered driving through the orchards near Cannes while the sky buzzed with Allied aircraft. For every kilometre we moved, he said, a tank burned. Still they pressed on, the smell of petrol and apples thick in the air, until naval shells began to fall among them like thunderbolts. The attack dissolved in smoke before it ever touched the beaches. By evening, Rommel was racing back from Germany in his staff car, the wind tearing at his cap, disbelief tightening in his chest. He had left for 48 hours. In that time, the Atlantic Wall had been breached and France was bleeding. When he reached his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon, he found officers pale and hollow-eyed, maps littered with black crosses. The invasion has succeeded, one of them said simply. Across Normandy, German units were fragmenting. Some fought to the last bullet, others vanished into the hedgerows. At Juno Beach, Grenadier Hans Wehner watched the Canadians push inland through smoke so thick it turned daylight to dusk. The noise was like an endless drum, he wrote. It beat the courage out of men. When his machine gun jammed, he threw down his helmet and ran until the forest swallowed him. Night fell again over the coast, lit by burning ships and tracer fire. The sea, which had roared all day, grew quiet. In the flicker of flames, the defenders could see what remained of the Atlantic Wall, cracked bunkers, twisted wire, the silhouettes of bodies on the tide. For the first time, many realized that the war was no longer about victory. It was about how long they could delay the inevitable. When Rommel finally stepped back onto French soil that night, the air itself seemed to hum with defeat. The roads that once carried his proud columns of armor were now clogged with smoke, wreckage, and wounded men limping through the ditches. From the hedgerows came the groan of cattle and the distant rhythmic pulse of Allied naval guns still reaching far inland. It was as if the sea had grown arms, one driver said later, and was pulling France apart. Rommel's convoy pushed through what remained of the 12th SS Panzer Division near Cannes. The young soldiers, some barely 17, stood caked in mud, faces streaked with soot, their uniforms soaked in sweat and fear. They were boys dressed for a funeral that had already begun. Their commander saluted stiffly and reported what Rommel already knew. The Allies were ashore in force, the beaches were lost, and the enemy was advancing under a shield of constant air power. Every few minutes the sky flared as another formation of bombers passed overhead. Columns of smoke rose where villages had once stood. Radio operators huddled beside broken equipment trying to raise the 7th Army. Nothing but static. The lines were down, the cables cut. The field telephones shattered. The great machine of German command had been silenced by paratroopers with wire cutters and knives. In his field diary, Rommel wrote that night, "We are fighting blind." Meanwhile, at Führer headquarters in Berchtesgaden, Hitler paced the floor of his private map room. He was radiant, almost joyous. The invasion, he insisted, was a diversion. The real landing, the decisive blow, would come at Calais, where his intelligence officers had been convinced the main Allied force still waited. "Let them exhaust themselves in Normandy," he said to Jodl and Keitel. "We will crush them when the true battle begins." And so the panzers stayed where they were, hundreds of tanks idling uselessly in the wrong place, waiting for orders that would never come. Back on the coast, the defenders at Bayeux and Caen fought alone. Lieutenant Karl Schaefer's anti-tank unit had been reduced from 12 guns to 3. "We fired until the barrels glowed," he remembered. "When we ran out of shells, we waited with pistols. A handful of soldiers tried to retreat toward the interior, but Allied Typhoon fighters swooped low, their rockets screaming down the narrow country roads. Trucks exploded like tin toys. Horses broke loose and ran burning into the fields." At midnight, Rommel gathered his senior staff in a candle-lit room of a ruined farmhouse. The maps were spread before him, the colored pins scattered by the tremors of artillery. He pointed toward the beaches. "The enemy is here," he said quietly, "and we cannot throw them back. Our only hope is to contain them, keep them near the sea and bleed them there." Someone asked about reinforcements. Rommel Sipt's eyes flashed. "Reinforcements," he said. "They will never arrive. The Führer is fighting ghosts while we fight reality." Outside, thunder rolled, no longer from the weather, but from the endless guns of the Allied fleet. In the distance, the hills of Normandy glowed faintly red, and above them the night sky flickered like a dying flame. By dawn, the German front had fractured into pockets, isolated strongpoints surrounded by advancing infantry and armor. Entire battalions vanished from the reports. Officers sent couriers who never returned. The smell of fuel and salt hung everywhere. The once invincible Wehrmacht, the engine of Europe's conquest, was now reduced to fragments scattered across hedgerows and farmyards. Rommel stood outside the farmhouse at sunrise, his boots caked with mud. A young officer approached and asked, almost pleading, "Herr Feldmarschall, what do we do now?" Rommel looked toward the distant coast where the smoke still rose from the beaches. He answered without turning his head, "Now we wait for the end to begin." By the third day, Normandy was no longer a place. It was a wound, open, raw, and endlessly bleeding. Smoke drifted low over the fields, mingling with mist and the faint, sweet smell of crushed apples from the orchards. German soldiers moved like shadows through hedgerows, rifles clutched tight, uniforms stiff with salt and blood. The roads were littered with wrecks, tanks burned down to black skeletons, overturned half-tracks, and horses lying still beside their wagons. Rommel had seen it before, long ago in Africa, the same confusion, the same disbelief that the enemy could simply appear everywhere at once. Only now there was no desert, no horizon, no escape. Normandy was a maze of stone walls and narrow lanes where every bend could hide a British tank or an American patrol. In theory, a counter-offensive was still possible. On paper, there were still reserves. The 12th SS Hitler-Jungen Division under Kurt Meyer, fanatical boys who had grown up on propaganda instead of food, was now pushing toward Caen. Their faces were young, but their eyes were already old. They sang as they marched, their voices hoarse, their boots splashing through the rain-soaked dirt. Meyer's orders were simple: drive the Allies back into the sea. But when his armored columns reached the outskirts of Caen, the sea had already followed them inland. Allied aircraft prowled the skies, dropping fire on every road and intersection. Convoys vanished in seconds. Engines blown apart, men flung into ditches, the air thick with dust and shrapnel. The German tanks would move only by night, creeping forward under the moonlight, engines whispering, the ground trembling beneath their tracks. Even then, the sound of bombers was never far away. Rommel drove from village to village in a haze of disbelief. Every place he visited had the same story: radios dead, lines cut, ammunition gone, morale collapsing. At some crossroads near St. Lo, he stopped to speak with a young lieutenant from the 352nd Division. The boy couldn't have been more than 20. His face was streaked with mud and fear. "What is your situation?" Rommel asked. The lieutenant stared blankly at the wreck of his platoon. "We are surrounded," he said. "But we don't set know by how many. The hedges have eyes." That night in Hitler's headquarters at Berchtesgaden, the mood was the opposite. The Führer refused to accept the reports coming from the front. He still believed the Normandy invasion was a feint, a clever deception to mask the real attack at Calais. "You will see," he told his generals. "They will come at Calais. Normandy is only a diversion." His staff nodded, terrified. No one dared to contradict him. Even as Allied divisions poured through the gaps in the line, Hitler refused to move the armored reserves from the north. The panzers that could have changed the battle sat motionless, their crews waiting for orders that would never come. Meanwhile, in the fields near Tilly-sur-Seulles, the SS clashed head-on with the British. It was a brutal, intimate kind of war, fought not across open plains but from hedge to hedge, tree to tree, the smell of gunpowder and wet grass heavy in the air. Grenades exploded with muffled thuds. The wounded lay face down in the mud, calling for medics who would never arrive. Entire companies vanished in the smoke. The Germans fought with desperation, not hope. Every bullet they fired was an act of denial, a refusal to admit what every man already knew. By June 10th, Rommel no longer spoke of victory. He spoke of survival. His diary entries from those days were brief, almost mechanical. Continuous bombing, no communications. Enemy armor advancing. Situation critical. He drove again to Cannes, where he found Meyer's SS troops crouched in the ruins of a farmhouse. The walls were blackened, the roof gone. The boys were silent, staring into nothing. One of them, maybe 16, cradled a photograph of his mother in both hands. She said, "I would never see war," he murmured, not looking up. Rommel said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He turned back toward his car, stepping over the twisted wreck of a tank track. Above him, the sky was streaked with light from tracer rounds and flares. In the distance, the Allied artillery rumbled like an endless storm. The field marshal climbed into the back seat and closed the door. For a moment, he simply stared out the window at the dark fields, at the burning horizon, at a world he could no longer command. Then he said quietly to his driver, "France is lost. Now we must save what's left of Germany." And the car rolled into the night, its headlights off, swallowed by the smoke of Normandy. The roads of Normandy were now rivers of ruin, burned trucks, overturned carts, and the dead of both armies lined the ditches. The air was thick with flies, and the sour scent of diesel, blood, and wet earth. To the German soldiers who still held their posts, the world had become very small, a single bunker, a single hedgerow, a few meters of ground that somehow still belonged to them. Rommel was not sleeping anymore. He moved constantly, his car bouncing over cratered roads, his driver weaving past wrecks and corpses. He would stop wherever a headquarters still existed, step inside, and find the same scene every time, maps covered in soot, telephones hanging silent, officers staring at each other like men who have woken up in a tomb. Orders were meaningless now. The front had dissolved into fragments, each fragment fighting alone. When Rommel finally spoke to Berlin, his voice was low and steady. "The enemy has complete control of the air," he said. "Our movement by day is impossible. Without reinforcements, the front will collapse." The reply came hours later, a short, clipped message signed by Keitel himself. "Hold at all costs. The Führer believes victory near." Rommel stared at the words for a long time before setting the paper down. "He believes," he said to no one in particular, "because he no longer sees." South of Cannes, the remnants of the 352nd and 21st Panzer tried one last stand along the road to Villers-Bocage. Their commanders gathered what tanks they could, machines coughing smoke, half their crews dead, and sent them forward into the hedgerows. It was suicide. British fireflies waited in ambush, their long barrels glinting between the apple trees. One by one, the panzers went up in flames, the crews scrambling out, their silhouettes black against the fire. "We had become ghosts in daylight," one gunner remembered. By the end of that week, the beaches were no longer battlefields, they were graveyards. The surf brought in pieces of helmets, shattered rifles, and boots filled with sand. Allied engineers were already building roads and depots where bunkers had stood. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's great dream of an unbreachable fortress, was now just rubble buried beneath American bulldozers. In Berlin, Hitler refused to hear the word defeat. His generals argued, he shouted them down. He claimed the Allies were bogged down, that new wonder weapons would soon turn the tide. But the reports from France told a different story. Thousands of prisoners, villages lost, divisions destroyed. Normandy, one colonel wrote, has become a grave that keeps getting deeper. On June 17th, Rommel wrote his final report to the High Command. It was short, stripped of rhetoric, almost painfully honest. The enemy possesses overwhelming superiority in men and material. Continued resistance will result only in the destruction of the army and unnecessary loss of life. I request immediate authority to withdraw. There was no answer. The next day, as his car drove along a narrow country road outside Livorno, a British fighter swooped down out of the clouds. The first burst of cannon fire tore through the windshield. The car skidded, rolled into a ditch, and came to rest upside down. Rommel was pulled from the wreck, blood pouring from his head, barely conscious. His driver was dead. The field marshal of the Reich, the man Hitler had once called his desert fox, was carried away on a stretcher, his eyes open but unseeing. Back at the front, the surviving soldiers of the 7th Army heard the news with numb disbelief. For days they had been fighting without rest, trapped between the advancing Allies and Hitler's blind orders from afar. Some wept. Others simply walked away, disappearing into the countryside, stripping off their uniforms and pretending to be farmers. And then, for the first time in years, the guns began to fall silent. The thunder that had rolled since dawn on June 6th faded into the wind. In its place came the soft, irregular sounds of life returning, the cries of gulls, the splash of the tide, the distant bells of French villages that were free again. Those who survived looked around and realized they were living inside the ruins of a myth, the myth of German invincibility, the myth of an empire built on fear. Normandy had torn it all apart. One German soldier later wrote in his diary, "We had believed we were defending Europe, but on those beaches we defended only the memory of something already dead." By mid-July, the German army in Normandy was disintegrating in slow motion. The once proud divisions that had defended Hitler's Europe now staggered through a landscape of ash and ruin. The orchards around Cannes had been churned to mud, the villages flattened, the hedgerows shredded by tank fire. For the men who remained, the war no longer moved in lines or fronts. It seeped through fields and ditches in every direction at once. General Hans Eberbach, who had replaced Rommel after the field marshal's injury, rode along the shattered road to Falaise and found nothing resembling an army. Just columns of stragglers, walking wounded, half-burned trucks and farmers' carts loaded with corpses. The stench of gasoline and decay clung to everything. The sky was never empty from dawn to dusk. Allied fighter-bombers prowled above the valleys, their engines droning like insects, striking at anything that moved. Each explosion sent flocks of crows wheeling out of the trees, black against the smoke. In Berlin, Hitler still demanded counterattacks. He imagined fresh panzer brigades sweeping the Allies into the sea, but the orders reached Normandy like prayers whispered to a dead god. The tanks were gone, the fuel gone, the men either dead or lost. "We are fighting ghosts," wrote one officer of the 21st Panzer Division. "Our maps show units that no longer exist." At the same time, Allied forces were closing the jaws of a trap. From the north, the Canadians and Poles drove southward. From the south, the Americans advanced through Argentan. Between them lay a narrow corridor of escape near the town of Falaise, 20 kilometers of broken road that the Germans called Der Kessel, the cauldron. It was the only path left out of Normandy, and every German soldier still alive was trying to reach it. The retreat was a vision of hell. Day after day, columns jammed the roads, horses screaming under shattered wagons, officers directing traffic with pistols drawn, tanks rumbling forward on empty fuel tanks, their crews too afraid to abandon them. Overhead, the Allied aircraft came again and again, their machine guns cutting through the smoke. Every few meters, a new fire blossomed, and the road filled with bodies. Lieutenant Franz Riedel remembered it vividly. The road was alive with fire. Men ran into the fields, and the fields burned too. We moved only at night. guided by the glow of the horizon. When dawn came, the horizon was closer. By the second week of August, the noose had tightened. The Allies shelled the corridor relentlessly. Inside the pocket, German divisions dissolved under the bombardment. Units that had once boasted thousands now counted fewer than 100 men. Communications broke down completely. Officers gave orders by shouting into the wind, and through it all came the endless columns of wounded men with torn faces, bandaged eyes, arms in slings, walking in silence toward a horizon that no longer existed. The survivors who reached Falaise found the town unrecognizable. The streets were choked with rubble, dead horses blocked the bridges, the church spire leaned at an impossible angle. Among the ruins, chaplains moved from man to man, offering confession to soldiers who no longer believed in absolution. One SS sergeant was heard to murmur, "Tell them in Berlin we fought to the last shadow." On August 21st, the jaws of the trap finally closed. The Canadians and Poles met south of Trun, sealing the pocket. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything the Germans had yet endured. The valley of Falaise became a furnace, fires burning for miles, the smell of death hanging so thick that even Allied soldiers would later speak of it in whispers. Out of 100,000 men, fewer than half escaped. The rest lay beneath the grey smoke that curled over the fields of Normandy. For the Wehrmacht, it was not a defeat, it was an extinction. The army that had once marched across Europe was now reduced to broken remnants stumbling eastward toward the Seine, leaving behind their dead, their guns, and the illusion that Germany could ever win this war. In Berlin, Hitler refused to hear the numbers. He ordered promotions, decorations, speeches about heroism. But the truth was already written in the ashes of Falaise. Normandy was lost. France was bleeding free. And the Third Reich, though it did not yet know it, had already begun to die. The rain came again in late August, washing the dust and blood from the roads, but not the memory of what had happened. The German army was no longer retreating. It was fleeing. Through the valleys and burned towns of northern France, long, ragged columns crept eastward toward the Seine, each step taking them deeper into defeat. Trucks ran on fumes, tires bound with rags, horses pulled wagons without wheels, dragging the dead through the mud. The sky was filled with the constant snarl of Allied fighters. Whenever the rain stopped, the killing resumed. Among the wreckage, discipline evaporated. Entire units moved without officers. Officers without orders. The road signs had been torn down or changed by the French resistance, so the columns wandered in circles through the countryside. Sometimes they passed villages where white sheets hung from windows, symbols of surrender to the Allies. The Germans stared up at them with blank faces, too hollow for anger. Some tore the sheets down and used them as bandages. Rommel lay in a hospital bed near Ulm, his head still bandaged from the air attack that had nearly killed him. Outside his window, the fields were quiet, untouched by war, but his mind remained in Normandy. He dictated letters to his staff, urging a ceasefire, a political solution, anything that might prevent Germany from total destruction. "We cannot win," he told his aide. "The only question now is how much of Germany must die before we admit it." His words never reached Hitler. They were intercepted, watered down, or ignored. In Berlin, the Führer had entered the stage of fury and delusion. He accused his generals of cowardice, betrayal, even treason. He ordered the arrest of several officers who had survived Normandy, claiming they had disobeyed his orders to fight to the last bullet. The very phrase, once a rallying cry, had become a death sentence. Hitler's map of Europe still hung on the wall, but the pins marking his armies had been pushed so close together they almost overlapped. The Western Front was collapsing. The Eastern Front bled daily. Yet he spoke of new weapons, secret divisions, miracles still to come. By the time the remnants of the 7th Army reached the Seine, they were shadows. The river that had once been a defensive line was now a graveyard of metal. Tanks floated half submerged. The bodies of soldiers drifted between the reeds. At dawn, Allied artillery began again, hammering the opposite bank. The bridges fell one by one, leaving the Germans stranded, firing back with weapons that no longer worked, their uniforms scorched and torn. Many threw their rifles into the river and swam for the far shore, clutching their medals, their memories, anything that would not sink. In one small village north of Rouen, a group of SS soldiers stood beside their wounded commander who could no longer walk. He ordered them to leave him behind. They hesitated until he drew his pistol and fired it once into the air. The echo faded, and the men obeyed. Hours later, Allied tanks rolled through the same street, past the bodies and the broken sign that still read "To Paris." Rommel heard the news from his hospital bed. Paris had fallen and the Allies were crossing the Seine. The Atlantic Wall was gone. The front shattered. When his adjutant told him that Hitler had called the retreat from France a strategic withdrawal, Rommel's eyes closed slowly. A withdrawal, he said, into the grave. That night he wrote to his wife, Lucy. The soldiers did all that men could do. They fought for each other long after they stopped fighting for the Reich. If there is any mercy left in this war, it will be that it ends soon. By the end of August, the last German convoys disappeared into Belgium, leaving behind a France reborn and a legend in ruins. The men who had once believed they were defending Europe now trudged eastward toward a home that no longer existed, chased by the sound of liberation bells ringing behind them. And somewhere in the ruins of Caen, amid the smell of oil and rain, a French farmer found a rusted German helmet lying half buried in the mud. Inside, carved in clumsy letters, was a single word: Heimat. Home. He picked it up, looked toward the west where the sea still roared, and left it there. September 1944. Germany still called Rommel a hero, but the man himself no longer recognized that word. The desert fox who had once outrun British tanks in Africa now sat in his garden at Hurlingen, a pale shadow of his former self, head still wrapped in white bandages, his eyes darkened by pain and disillusionment. The sound of war was still in the air, distant artillery echoing from the west, the dull rumble of bombers at night. But for Rommel the real noise came from within, the grinding collapse of everything he had once believed. Letters from the front arrived daily, written by officers who had served under him in Normandy. Most were dead before their words reached him. They spoke of the retreat through Belgium, of boys with rifles older than themselves, of entire battalions scattered by Allied planes before they ever reached the line. "We fight without maps, without orders, without faith," one wrote. "The Führer says hold, and so we hold, but the ground beneath us moves." Rommel read each letter carefully, his hands trembling. The idea of loyalty, once sacred, had become poison. He had followed Hitler out of duty, not devotion, but even that was crumbling. In his diary he wrote, "To be loyal to Germany now means to be disloyal to Hitler, yet to oppose him is to become what we once fought against. There is no path left that does not lead to ruin." Berlin, meanwhile, had become a city of whispers. The failed assassination attempt on July 20th had unleashed a storm of paranoia. Officers vanished overnight. The Gestapo prowled the corridors of the High Command. Even the wounded were interrogated in their hospital beds. Names were being crossed off lists in red pencil, one by one, silently, efficiently. Rommel Sipp's own name was already among them. Hitler no longer trusted him. Reports from the SS painted him as defeatist, unreliable, even sympathetic to traitors. When Rommel's letters suggesting peace negotiations were intercepted, they were taken directly to the Führer. So Hitler said, "The fox has lost his nerve." Olska said, "The fox has lost his nerve." Still, Rommel believed there might be time. He met secretly with other generals, men like Karl Heinrich von Stolpnagel and Claus von Stauffenberg's remaining sympathizers, discussing how to end the war before Germany itself was destroyed. They spoke in whispers with the curtains drawn, using phrases like national salvation instead of resistance. The plan was desperate but clear: remove Hitler, negotiate with the Allies, and save what remained of the army before the Soviets reached Berlin. But time was no longer theirs to spend. By October, the Gestapo had gathered enough fragments to form a noose. Witnesses had placed Rommel's name among the conspirators. His old friends began to disappear. One morning, his adjutant, Captain Aldinger, returned from Berlin pale as chalk. "They are coming," he whispered. On October 14th, two generals from Hitler's personal staff arrived at Rommel's house. They wore long leather coats and polite smiles, the kind of men who brought death with impeccable manners. Lucy Rommel saw them from the window and knew. They were offered coffee, which they declined. Rommel walked with them into his study, closed the door, and for 15 minutes the house was silent. When the door opened again, his face was calm, almost peaceful. He told his wife that the Führer had given him a choice, a public trial and disgrace or an honorable death by his own hand, with full state honors for his family. He embraced her, whispered something that no one ever heard, and stepped outside with the officers. They drove him to a small clearing on the edge of the forest near Hurlingham. The car stopped. Rommel straightened his uniform, removed his gloves, and looked out across the trees, now golden with autumn. "A soldier's life ends in service," he said softly. Then he swallowed the cyanide capsule. He was dead within minutes. The car drove away, leaving no mark but a shallow rut in the damp earth. In Berlin, the radio announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of his wounds from Normandy. There was no mention of the visit, no mention of the poison, no mention of the choice. But among the surviving officers of the Western Front, the truth spread quietly. "The fox is gone," they said. But he turned before he fell. And somewhere in the ruins of Europe, beneath the weight of fire and history, the last of Germany's honor was buried with him. Winter came early to Germany that year, hard and grey and merciless. The wind that swept across the fields carried with it more than cold. It carried the echo of something broken, something that could never be rebuilt. The Third Reich was dying, not with the roar of triumph it had promised, but with the slow, uneven breath of exhaustion. Cities were ruins, rivers were choked with ice and wreckage, and the trains no longer ran on time. The war that had once seemed endless was finally beginning to feel finite. And in that fading silence, the memory of Normandy lingered like a ghost. To the German soldiers who had survived, it was the beginning of the end, the moment the sky fell and history itself turned against them. Those who had watched the sea burn at Omaha, who had crouched beneath the thunder of Allied shells at Caen, could never forget the sound. It was the sound of inevitability, of a world larger than orders or obedience crashing through every lie they had been taught to believe. Some of them returned home and never spoke of it again. Others wrote in notebooks that no one would read. "We thought we were defending Europe," one veteran wrote in 1946, "but we were only defending a dying dream. When the sea came for us, it wasn't set the Allies. It was the truth." In Berlin, Hitler raged and fantasized until the very walls shook. His maps had become meaningless. His speeches were sermons to an empty room. But outside, in the villages of France, the world he had tried to conquer was being rebuilt. Children played in fields where tanks had burned. The ruins of Caen sprouted flowers in the spring. Life, slow and stubborn, was returning. And yet, among those who had stood on the other side of the wall, there remained a strange kind of reverence, not for what they fought for, but for what they had endured. The defenders of Normandy were not heroes, not villains, but men caught in the gears of something vast and senseless. Many had no choice, no hatred, no faith in the cause that consumed them. They fought because the world around them demanded it. They died because no one could stop it. Rommel's name lived on, reshaped by legend. In the years that followed, he became a symbol of what Germany might have been, a soldier of discipline, of honor, of reluctant clarity. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He had seen too much, understood too late, and died believing that duty and conscience could coexist. The war proved otherwise. When historians look back at D-Day, they see the triumph of liberation, the turning of the tide. But through German eyes, it was something else. The moment the illusion shattered, when even the most loyal began to understand that the Reich was mortal, that the promises of 1,000 years could not survive a single dawn in Normandy. And perhaps that is why the story matters, not for the glory of conquest, but for the quiet realization that every empire ends, every ideology cracks, and every soldier, no matter his flag, must one day face the truth of what he fought for. In the end, the beaches of Normandy became not just a battlefield, but a mirror that showed the world what happens when belief outweighs humanity, when obedience becomes easier than doubt. The men on both sides saw themselves reflected there, terrified, uncertain, desperately human. As night fell over the channel once more, the sea was calm again. The wind moved softly across the sand where iron once stood, and the waves washed over the last traces of wire and bone. The war had moved east, but its shadow remained, long, dark, and unbroken. For the men who had defended the Atlantic Wall, the end had begun there on that stormy June morning when the sea turned to fire and the Reich learned what no fortress can stop: the weight of time.